Welcome to our 72nd panel discussion on South Sudan Women Intellectual Forum. My name is Nyanthon Hothmai. Our topic of discussion today is about climate disasters in South Sudan. Since the beginning of rainy season, we have been seeing horrifying images of helpless women, children, and elders who are emerging from some of our communities that are currently drowning in a floodwater in 7 states of our country. In addition, there are reports of some of our states that are facing severe droughts that we are currently not hearing about. These communities are overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what the impact of flood and drought that is eroding their livelihood and little coping with strategy they have. Without any help from us, they do not have any capacity to cope and recover from these disasters. So this is an important topic that is affecting many of our communities. So we are honored today to have with us in the studio Honorable Joseph Africano, the Undersecretary at the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and he's a leading expert in the field of forestry management and climate change. Also with us, we have Miriam Dangasu. She is both an engineer and policy expert in the energy, climate change, and environmental field. Also with us, we have Mr. Niall Tidmame, who is a senior researcher in the environment, protection, sustainable energy, natural resource management, climate change, and transparency, accountability, and sustainable management of extractive industry. With us here, we have Census Taban Lolion, who is an established international environmental management professional who has 10 years in experience. As an energy and climate change expert myself, and your moderator for today, I'll be guiding you through this discussion. For this discussion, we have 1 hour and a half. So we have divided this discussion into 4 rounds. Our first round will look into understanding climate change. We need to understand what are the key concepts and terminology so that we understand what climate change is. Our second round will be about climate change impact in South Sudan. Our third round will be about climate disasters preparedness, adaptation, mitigation against climate change. And the fourth round will give you, the viewers, the opportunity to participate by sending you out your questions, and our panelists in the studio will be able to answer for you. And then the last round will be us wrapping up the session. So without wasting more time, let's just dive right into our first question for the panelists. All our panelists, welcome to the studio. And I'll just dive in straight away. My first question goes to you, Mr. Niall. And one of the challenge of us being in the industry of climate change is really explaining to people what is climate change. And if we don't understand what is the problem, it's a problem. It's hard to devise what is the solution to the problem. So today I want to ask you, the panelists, to really take us together with the viewers, what is climate and what is weather? And how are these two terms different from each other? I'll start with you, Niall, and then I'll go to our next panelist. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Nyathon, and all the panelists. It's a pleasure to be part of this important panel discussion on an important issue that touches the life of our people. Climate, simply, is an average weather condition that extends up to more than 30 years or more for a particular location. So it's the average weather condition, daily temperatures, wind direction, and then this is average over a longer period of time. This forms the climate. And so if there is any season, for example, for a place like in South Sudan, it starts in April and ends in November, it means that this is our climate. And we all know it has been like that. But of course, over the last several years, we have seen the patterns where this climate pattern, or the trend where this climate pattern is basically changing. So no longer we don't have earlier rainy seasons anymore, like April. We are pushing basically into May, June, basically. And so this gives us an idea about what the climate is. So it's an average weather condition extending up to more than 30 years. And then the weather, of course, is the daily occurrences of things like temperature, could be lower or higher for that day, uh, cloud, raining, and so on and so forth. This is the weather. So today it may be sunny, tomorrow it may be cloudy, the other day, third day could be raining. So this is basically the weather. And the weather is the one that forms the climate. Thank you very much.
So my follow-up question would be, so now what is the difference, as you've just said? So the difference here is that the climate is an average duration of a long period of time, and normally we talk about 30 years, right, of the weather, uh, let's say temperature, daily temperature or daily rainfall, and averaging that for 30 years, and that's what makes our climate change. Would that be correct to say that, Neil?
Yes, exactly. Usually, 30 years is basically like the minimal, but it extends to more than that. So these daily occurrences, average of more than 30 years, is what form the pattern to be called the climate.
The climate of
Yes.
that. Okay.
Yeah, of that particular place, of course, because a place has a particular climate. So, like equatorial region, especially the green belt from source of central Equatoria all the way to western Equatoria to part of western Bargadal, it's a different climate altogether because it's green belt, rainfalls start earlier. So it's the same thing across South Sudan. As you move north, the rainfall season actually gets shorter and shorter. And so a specific location has a particular climate. And so sometimes now we get concerned about climate change because if that pattern changes, then it destabilizes our planning for the time for cultivation, time for certain place to move to for grazing and so many other things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'll come to you, census. And I think Niall has just taken us briefly on what is climate and what is weather. There's another term in climate change. We talk about climate variability, right? And we talk about climate change. And sometimes if you don't understand, sometimes it's confusing. Can you please take us through what is climate variability and what's climate change, and how are these two terminology different from each other?
Good morning and good afternoon to our viewers across the world. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Nyathon, for leading this discussion. Jumping right in, following to what Nyal has said, climate variability is then what is considered the various mean state and various occurrences, extreme occurrences that happen on the climate, whether it's on a spatial or temporal scale, beyond the normal weather events that Nyal stated. So this could be within an extended period of time between a decade or so, extended period of time where I'm hearing an echo. So between this extended period of time, what we end up seeing is that there is a huge variation of extreme weather events, of extreme periods of extended period of extreme events. And as opposed to the normal weather that Nyal was talking about, which is looking at your daily temperature variations and rain variations, climate variability then becomes the extended, where we try and look at how many times has it rained at such a high level and caused this amount of flooding. You know, what has been the extreme period of the river filling up beyond what is known as its 100-year flood line. It could be also as looking at drought, for instance. How many times has there been drought in certain parts of South Sudan? That then defines what's known as climate variability. It's just variations that occur across a long term. And this could be due to natural causes, or sometimes it could be due to air, ocean changes, your El Niños, your hurricanes, your volcanic eruptions. All of these different entities lead to what's known as climate variability. And following from climate variability, we then move to what's known as climate change. With climate change, it refers to a really drastic change in the climate that can be identified within a decade, beyond a decade, this is where we're looking at centuries, the changes that have happened across the different weather patterns, climate variability that has now led to a real change in over centuries in the weather. And for instance, now when they talk about how the Earth has heated up by an extended amount of degrees, or it's heating faster or something like that, this is based on data that has been collected for the past hundreds of years. And what weather specialists or climate specialists do is they go and look at this data statistically and start looking at what is this long-term change. So it's not just, okay, it's flooding, so we are affected by climate change. No, it's that this type of flooding has expanded and continued, and it's a difference from the normal pattern that the system has always had. And this is over 100 years, 200 years, 300 years. This is where they now come and use this term that's known as climate change. And it could be due to what's happening in our solar system, in our solar cycle, where there are shifts in all of these patterns that are affecting us. And this impacts take a long time to happen. They're not just spontaneous events that happen. So it looks at all of these things, as well as the impact on the rising sea level, and how this is leading to expanded periods of disasters along a huge time frame. I want people to understand that huge time frame. I think a challenge for us in South Sudan is that we haven't had enough data collected locally for us to fully analyze the impacts, or whether we are impacted by all of this aspect of climate change on a global level. Yes, we are, but as to how much of it is caused by our climate variability and weather patterns, all of that is not fully available. And I think these are information that Honorable Joseph would be able to give us more information on.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think what I'm hearing from you is that our solar system, or let's say our Earth, has its own system. There's certain time where in our own period where we'll have extreme, floods, we'll have extreme drought, which is a normal cycle of how the Earth is. That's climate variability. It's part of the Earth system. But then, as you're saying, right, climate change now increases the frequency of these high, intense, or severe droughts and severe floods. This is what I'm hearing from you. Honorable, we're really eager to hear from you. So let me jump first to Miriam now, and then now we'll shift back. We'll go to you, Miriam. Please take us. And Census has already touched a bit on this, so take us through as well. What is global warming, and what is the difference between global warming and climate change? These two terms have always used interchangeably. Can you please take us through what are they and how are they different?
Thank you, Nyathon. Thank you very much. So global warming is simply the rise in global temperatures. And this is due to the increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So how that is different from climate change, since as mentioned, climate change is the increasing changes in the measures of climate over a long period of time. And these include measuring precipitation, temperature, wind patterns, and so on. In global warming, the Earth's greenhouse gases, which are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and even water vapor, are trapped. They trap heat in the atmosphere and warm the planet by having that heat remaining within the atmosphere surrounding the Earth. So what causes global warming is basically when CO2 is one of the largest contributor of greenhouse gases, and it stays in the atmosphere for a long time, for a long period of time. So when it's trapped and collected in the atmosphere, it absorbs the sunlight and the solar radiation that have bounced off the surface of the Earth. And by collecting those sunlight and radiation and heat, it now warms the atmosphere. Thank you, Nyathon.
Thank you. Thank you. And now we have come to you, Honorable Africana. We are so eager to hear from you. And here, basically, we want you to let's understand what is the global warming and how is it related to various climate disasters we have in South Sudan? What is adaptation and what is mitigation? So the stage is yours, and please take us through these questions.
Thank you, Nathan, and Sensors, Nyal, and Engineer. I'm very delighted to be a panelist in this very important discussion. It's timely, and we now know that climate change is now one of the serious challenges that the world is facing, and it's now an existential threat. And I'm happy that the three have kind of like set the tone and explained what climate variability, weather, and climate and global warming is all about. So I think I won't be able to talk a lot about that because it will be a repetition. But I would like to just come in as government, what we are trying to do about the issues of climate change. In 2014, South Sudan acceded to the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. And by then, when we acceded to, there have been several negotiations, COPs, where people were trying to get an agreement on how we can adapt or mitigate the impacts of climate change. And I think one of the firmest agreement is the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is the world we are trying to reduce global warming or the global temperature to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's an agreement that the whole world is supposed to contribute towards achieving that goal. As a country, we all know that our emissions in South Sudan are negligible. And since the burning of fossil fuel and what's happening is climate change currently is man-made. And we have the major countries like US, China, Brazil, UK, and the rest are contributing more in terms of emissions, carbon emissions. So that's why we as a country are now feeling the impacts of those actions that these people have done in terms of the variability and the change of climate patterns that we have in our country. At the moment, we know that South Sudan, we are experiencing regular droughts. And now this is the second year or the third year that we have floods, areas like Jongole, Unity, Meridi, even here in Juba and Sherikat, people are being affected. So it's becoming, the interval is becoming too regular. That simply means climate change or the weather patterns that we have changed, have shifted. And with the droughts, our rainfall patterns have changed, as Nyal has alluded to earlier. We usually have our rains usually start in April, but this year it started in July. But the information about this climate variability or climate change to our people is so scarce. Our people in the rural area still believe that nothing has changed, so they start preparing their fields in say March with expectation of rains to start falling in April. So when they plant their seeds, we might have some rains here and there, then everything stops. So there's a lot of crop failure in South Sudan, coupled with the flooding. So I think it's a huge disaster that is happening at the moment. So for us, we are now trying to see that we adapt to this new condition and also mitigate the impacts. So as a country that is still it's in infancy, we will have to make sure that our people adapt to the impacts of climate change, and also in our energy sector, instead of like investing in generators, or we have to go for clean energy, hydro, solar, geothermal, wind, and all that kind of stuff. As a country, we have now developed our adaptation plan, NAPA, which is a very good document. And it has about 28 projects that if we implement all those projects, at least our people will be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Likewise, we have recently updated and enhanced our nationally determined contribution, which is a requirement for all parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to develop a nationally determined contribution. So we have in our mitigation section, we are trying to see that South Sudan produce at least 3,000 megawatts of clean energy. And also we have to do a lot of tree planting. So that's something that we will really need to do. That should be our development trajectory. We have to go green. But the most important thing at the moment, since climate change is here with us, we need really to adapt to that. And as we have now developed some projects, 2 that have been approved. One is building the capacity of government and communities to adapt to climate change. And another one is on smart agriculture, because with smart agriculture, we don't have to go to the old norms. We need now to really see what kind of seedlings are we supposed to plant. We have to do some intensive land use, agroforestry, water harvesting, and all that kind of stuff. So that's what we are trying to do as government. And the most important thing also, we would like to assure our people that we are doing all we can. But since we have not contributed towards what we are now experiencing, we would like to see that what has been agreed in the Paris Agreement, that developed country parties raise $100 billion annually in order for us to be able to implement all those projects in our adaptation and in our mitigation plans. Thanks.
Thank you. What I'm hearing, some of the climate disaster that we are currently experiencing is drought and flood. And mitigation basically is for us to reduce some of the factors that are causing the impact of climate change in the first place. And then adaptation now is for us to adapt into the changes that what is happening in our climate and our weather. Okay. Thank you on that. And Niall, I want to come to you. We've just heard from the Honorable Afrikaner, and he mentioned flood and drought are some of the climate change impacts that we're currently experiencing in South Sudan. Can you take us through as well? Do we have other natural disasters in this country, and what are some of the climate change? What are some of the impact we are currently experiencing in South Sudan? Unmute yourself. We can hear you. We still can't hear you. Unmute you. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Most of the impacts, the ongoing impacts, have already been covered by Honorable Joseph Afrikaner Bashal. And what I would like to add is to emphasize and to say that global warming basically is part of the changes. And so we have seen rise in temperatures in South Sudan since the 1970s, more than 1 degree extra increase in temperatures in South Sudan, which is a huge difference in terms of affecting the climatic balance, and the heat wave. So I'm sure you remember some years ago, a village in northern Barghazal was basically banned because of the storm And people actually wondered why this is happening. And it's basically part of climate change. You know, climate change is going to cause more storms, windstorm, thunderstorms that can always even be accompanied with lightning and thunderbolts and fires. And, you know, they can, because of too much temperatures in the atmosphere. So it leads to these kinds of weather events, extreme weather events that we have never seen. So even like several years ago, and I'm sure most of you actually read this in the media, it was a huge disaster in northern Pakistan. When it happened, people were like, I think it might have been God sending this. But of course, this is a part of climate change. And, you know, it has been projected that the such incidents of storms will increase with further increase in temperatures. So that's one factor. And then the other one is that these floods we are seeing here have actually increased in the frequency. So we have seen the frequency in the last 30 years. If we go by the measure that at least 30 years to see whether the climate has changed, since 1991, between 1991 and 2021, we have seen incidents of floods of both moderate magnitude and extreme magnitude, 26 flood incidents. So between 1991, over 30 years, 26 of them. It means that almost every year we have been seeing flood. And I can go back to 2005, up to now, we have seen flood anywhere in South Sudan, in the South Sudanese floodplains, in the east, in Jonglei, in Bentiu or Unity State, in Upper Nile, in Werrab, in Lakes, in Western Pakistan, and in other parts of the country. So, and we have seen a situation where the floods and the droughts are happening in the same season. Like this year, as Honorable Africano has mentioned, this year we saw a delay in the start of the rainfall season. So up to July, that's when rainfall came. And then now crop failed, and people were waiting to actually plant for the second season. In fact, because in South Sudan, we plant twice, from April or from March, especially if you are in Equatoria, it's March. In Upper Nile, it is April to July. But you know, the whole season for some people in some parts of the country, actually the whole season failed because of the dry spell. And then all of a sudden, it was too much rainfalls and then the flood, which we are now witnessing. So this is the kind of pattern that we are seeing. So these patterns, so they are basically related to climate change because there is extreme level of this flood pattern. There is also extreme change in the normal patterns of when the rainfalls are starting. And also it has been observed also by those who have actually done studies that our starting rainfall seasons have been basically reducing basically. So the rainfall season from April to June has considerably decreased, and that's why the U.S. Geological Society estimated, like about 9 years ago, that we have seen reduction of up to 20% summer rainfalls all over South Sudan. And most of it is because of the delay in the rainfall season. And what is causing the delay in the rainfall season? It is because of the increase in the temperatures. So because the rainfalls, the start of the rainfall season is close to a dry season. It's close to when we witness high temperatures, like March in South Sudan is the month where we have the highest temperatures. And so this one is basically because of the increase already in temperatures. So this is basically shifting the starting season for the rainfall because of too much rainfall. So the drying up is happening. And this drying up it means that there is small moisture in the atmosphere. And that's why we are witnessing very little rainfall in April now and in June. That's why we are witnessing delayed in rainfalls. It's because we are witnessing high temperatures. And these high temperatures are drying up our vegetation and our soil moisture. And all these they actually contribute to the local rainfalls that we have, apart from, of course, the rainfalls that come from the Indian Ocean. So these are some of the observed patterns in South Sudan that we believe to be part of climate change. Of course, this is the normal trend across Africa and across the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Miriam, I am going to get somebody mute. I'm hearing echo for myself. So Miriam, I'm coming to you, and I just want to follow. I'm hearing an echo. Can we all mute so that I don't hear echo from on my end? So Miriam, I'm coming to you. Could you take us through how do we know that this drought that we are currently experiencing, or you can choose drought or flood, how do we know whatever we're experiencing now is an effect of climate change and not the normal climate variability? I just want us to sort of finalize this so that now we can transition to what are some of the solutions to this climate change problem. So Miriam, to you.
Of drought to climate change, it is very important to distinguish between weather and climate. And as my colleagues have mentioned, climate change occurs over extended periods of time and manifests as changes in the patterns of weather events that one will generally expect. And this is based on historical averages. So when one particular dry period in the past could have been more drier than a particular dry period now, dry periods in South Sudan are increasing in prevalence, severity, and duration as our overall climate changes. Also, the IPCC collected data that indicates that the mean annual temperatures across South Sudan have increased by more than 0.4 degrees every decade for the last 30 years, and projected to even increase further to between 1 and 1.5 degrees by 2060. And this will create a much warmer and drier climate. So in most of the country, the rising temperatures are associated with future climate change and are expected to decrease the surface soil moisture. It's already happening, but I will see it more and more decrease in soil moisture. So even without future changes in precipitation, this drying of soil, which is related to droughts, is likely to cause future increased droughts across most of the countries. And we'll expect the droughts to be stronger and lasting longer than in the past. So this is how we know that the droughts we are experiencing and going to experience in the future are effects of climate change and not normal variability. Thank you, Nyakon.
Okay, so I think we have come to the conclusion of our first round, and what we just wanted to is just to sort of establish the context of what climate change is and what are some of the key technologies and concepts that we normally talk about. Other normally wouldn't understand what they are. And without understanding what the key concept are and what climate change is, it's difficult for even to convince other people actually our climate is changing. So Honorable African, I know you're representing the government, but at the same time, we do respect you're a leading expert as well in this area. So we are going to pull both of your hats in this discussion. And as somebody as well who is very much involved in climate change issue, and of course you are mostly involved in policy part of the climate change mitigation adaptation. You've had experience of knowing what are some of the climate change impact on our community. And for example, in terms of social, in terms of health, economic, environment, what are some of the consequences of drought and flood our community currently experiencing based on the work that you do within the ministry and some of the work that you get involved with?
Climate change should be considered a security issue, and it's also a livelihood issue. And now what we'll be expecting from this climate change we are going to have a lot of climate refugees. Like now, areas of Jongole, people have to move to Mangala, even to mostly in central Equatoria, and most of them have lost their livelihoods, and they're living in very squalid conditions where diseases such as cholera, lack of clean water, and all that will impact the health of children. Most of the displaced, internally displaced people due to these climate issues are not going to school. The economic and the social and economic situation of these people, are impacted, and we have now to depend more on humanitarian assistance. Likewise, a lot of migration is happening, like the pastoralists coming to the areas where you have agriculturalists, and it's causing a lot of tension. It's not making of their own, but now the climate situation is exacerbating what has been a normal pattern where people will come during the dry season to areas where there is water and grazing, but now they have to be there constantly. So it's not only going to affect the health, the economy, and the livelihood of the people, but also causing new conflicts among our people. So likewise, what we are also experiencing in our country, 99.9% of our people depend on forest as a source of energy, fuel, wood, charcoal, and all that. And we are now destroying most of our virgin forest. Like now, when you see around Juba, when you're going towards Torit, Magui, Mangala, and I've just received some reports, and now people have entered into Badingilo Natural Wildlife Reserve. People are now cutting charcoal there, going towards Luri, Jebel Ladu. So it's a huge disaster happening to our forest. And we all know that forests sequester carbon. And by cutting all the forests, now we are also getting issues of floods, because now there is no vegetation. So the water has to go, the runoff, causing floods in some areas. So climate change is really affecting us as a country seriously. So that's why we are trying to look into it as a security issue, and it has to be tackled by all sectors of government, such that we try to address it. But the most important thing that we need to look into now is our energy policy. Since only 1% of our population have access to electricity, and we are putting more pressure to our forest, I think if we can do some mitigation, trying to plant more trees and invest in clean energy, we will try to reduce the impact on our forest, and we'll try to kind of like also try to get some control to our microclimate. And the next thing is there are some areas that have been that, like Bor, I think I did some research, and I think Nyal is from Bor. Bor means floods. So what we need to do is try to see how are we going to solve the issue of flooding in Bor. Some people are coming with trying to revisit the Jongole Canal, which is a no-no to me. And I think we need to see how we rezone that area, and people are not supposed to inhabit swampy areas and try to go to the highlands. And we also try to see if we can invest more on dikes. Recently, there was a project with the Dutch government trying to put something, project on control of constructing dikes and maintaining whatever has been constructed in Bor. That is something that we have to look into. So For me, we as a country, we need to play our part. That's why we have come up with a nationally determined contribution where all the 14 sectors of government, and we have come up with strategies to make sure that we become climate proof by implementing those strategies. And I think I will try to recommend to all of you and those who are listening to this discussion of ours to visit to read our nationally determined contributions. It's going to be passed as a policy, as a climate policy. It's a very good document. We have just submitted it, and we have gotten some really good comments from the executive director of UNFCCC. It's a good document, but the cost for us to be able to implement that up to 2050 is around $100 billion. What we have assessed as government for us to be able to do in that amount is only about 20 million. So the rest, the 80 billion, no, 20 billion, but the 80 billion should come from say, we have to get a slice from the 100 billion yearly that will be contributed towards the fighting climate change. So we know very well that South Sudan, if we continue with this, will be the most impacted country, because even the IPCC have noted that a country like ours, which is least developed, and even with the least emissions, we are being impacted greatly. Also, with our current conflicts, we have a lot to do as a country. We have to silence the guns, and we have now to invest in energy and also try to look into how we can get all the adaptation strategies and adapt to this situation that the whole world is experiencing. Thanks.
No, thank you. I would actually like a few follow-up questions for you, Honorable. You mentioned in our introduction that we have NAPA, and under NAPA we have 28 programs under NAPA. What are some of the problems that are directly related to the impact of flooding that is taking place in Jonglei, and what is included in those strategies to help these communities?
In dealing with NAPA, I think the most important thing that our people need to know beforehand or before a disaster strike is the information. So as a country, we don't have an early warning system, and that's something that we would like to develop, an early warning system and disaster risk reduction plans. It's in the NAPA. I think that is one project that we are trying to develop. At the moment, we have some say early warning system with FAO, the humanitarian affairs have something. So it is, and everybody is working in silos. So we'd like to make sure that we harmonize all that information such that we try to get the information to people. Now in the ministry, we have the meteorology department, but the meteorology department currently is with the Ministry of Transport, and what they do is only to monitor the weather for airplanes landing and all that kind of stuff. So people are not getting meteorological data, weather data, rainfall data, and all that kind of stuff. So we are trying to develop that system. So the most important thing for us, if we know exactly what we are going to expect, we can focus the rainfall. We can also try to see whether we are going to have heat waves or delay in that, such that we try to give that information to our people. So that system is very important, such that our people are not just taken by surprise. So as a ministry, we are now putting the project proposal for the early warning system in place. We are working with UNDP and UNEP, and we are trying also to see where all those scattered data are. Now, as a country, most of our data is with the meteorological department in Khartoum. Data going back to, I think, 100 or more than 100 years. So we also need to get those data from Khartoum and try to kind of like also try to get our coefficients formula such that we'll be able to also predict our weather. So that's something that we like to do. And also in the adaptation, we are looking at smart agriculture projects, because that's South Sudan is an agricultural country. The economy of this country is actually supposed to be agriculture. So most of the projects will be in terms of smart agriculture. We try to give our people drought-resistant seeds, try to establish do a lot of water harvesting, also look into agroforestry and intensive land use management. Those are some of the things that we'll like to look into. Waste management, that's a big thing too that we have to develop. So the 28 projects are really good projects, and the NAPA document is there. They are all costed. Out of the 28, we have only 2 now that we managed to get funds. And recently we met with the World Bank, came to us, and they're ready to look into our projects so that they can fund some of those adaptation projects for the country. Thanks.
Thank you. So I would like to, Census, Niall, and Miriam, I know we'll come as well to a session where we'll talk more about the government program, what they're doing, and we will all have questions to Honorable Africano. But before we do that, Census, I would want you to add to what Honorable has just said about some of the consequences of flooding or drought on gender specifically, and then he's already mentioned on displacement and resettlement, and then you can add other points. So welcome to that before we move to our next session.
Thank you very much. And it was really a great explanation from Africano regarding what the government is doing and all the various initiatives. Just to add on to the various consequences that we have seen from floods and drought, I think it's important to remember that we are a country that is least developed. That means a large population, a large group of our population do not have adequate access to various methods of acquiring their livelihoods. And this means a lot of their livelihood is based on the resources on the land, whether it's planting or cattle farming, or accessing water from the river. All of these are taken from the environment, from the ground. But when we have this extreme weather events and droughts and flooding, for instance, during drought period, it means the land is dry, the soil is dry and does not have enough water or even moisture for you to be able to plant. And we notice during those periods that there is a decrease in crop yield, as well as increase in the number of people that end up hungry, you know. And when we go into flooding, we also see that there is an impact in terms of lack of clean water and even lack of access to food or any of those. When we look at it from a gender lens, it's important to remember that there is a lot of unequal power relations in terms of how our traditional setup is. And as such, there's a lot of inequalities in terms of who does the most housework and who accesses a lot of these resources that is needed to help people, as well as that there is a huge lack of safety nets, whether it's savings or access to means to try and support and decrease the consequences of all of this different climate vulnerability. In South Sudan, one important part that we see is, for instance, in communities that are cattle herders, the impact of drought and even flooding results in relocation to greener pastures, right? And a lot of this is done by young men. And this results in them having clashes with other communities that value the green pastures that they have, because that is considered as part of their crops. Those are part of their crops. So there are all of these contention, but you notice that some of this have more male conducting these activities versus women. And when we look at the impact on women or the consequences, the truth is a lot of the time women do not have a lot of access. First, a lot of them are the ones who deal with the agriculture. They're the main caregivers, and they don't have a lot of resources to even be able to look after their own families. But during periods of drought, it requires them walking long distances to try and get access to water. When it comes to flooding, for instance, you find that they have to constantly carry the brunt of trying to take care of the family, of trying to take care of the children, of trying to find ways of looking for food to cook, of looking for firewood. And walking long distance inside flooded water has a lot of impact on them because of women who are pregnant. This results in them having a lot of diseases, and they lose a lot of their children around that period. Some of them don't know how to swim a lot. As such, if there is too much flooding, you find that some of them do not even make it through that. And if the water is too strong when they're even trying to cross the rivers, some of them get carried over by this type of strong water. And when we look at periods of drought, you find that women prioritize feeding the men and the children, which means they at the end up consuming less, or in some cases hardly consume any food. And so all of these stresses has a huge impact on just their survival and their ability to cope and their ability to continue to take care of the family. And it's important to remember that when we have also issues of drought, looking at the lens from the male in terms of cattle herders, there is a lot of competition for water bodies, and this results in clashes with other communities, other cattle herders coming in and clashing on trying to occupy that region. And through that process, we also lose a lot of lives. So this has had a lot of impact and a lot of consequences. It's different in some places that they do not have such a large cattle herding community. So the impact of what men deal with is a bit limited, but with ours and with the communities in South Sudan, that has a large impact on them. So when we look at it moving forward and just tying it into what Honorable Africano was saying, is that, you know, we are hoping all these coping mechanisms that they're trying to plan through the various NAPA and what they are setting as various projects actually take into consideration and prioritize how each of these group men and women are looked at, and how prioritize, you know, whether you're going to be increasing areas where you give water to people for cattle herding, prioritize what women have and access to medication, the impact of all of this floods and drought on them, as well as prioritize having food for the children, because you find that breastfeeding women during dry season also do not have enough milk to give their children the adequate nutrition. And this is the most I can add at the moment, but we can discuss this further. Thank you.
Thank you, Census. And you've really highlighted some of the consequences of climate change. I really want to shift us back a little bit from our program, and I was just looking at some of the comments that our viewers are putting out, and I think it's very important that we start addressing some of those things before we dive into some of the programs in terms of preparation, mitigation, adaptation the government is currently planning. So I'm going to throw a question, and please, whoever think that they can be able to answer this, please, you're highly welcome. There's always, and I think I just want to take us back to the cost of flooding in Jonglei. And one of the viewers was saying that flooding is not only in Jonglei, because it seems that we are only focusing on Jonglei. Flooding is in Unity State. Flooding is also in Upper Nile, right? And we've talked of seven. I mean, some of our 7 states have been affected by flooding. So the question here is, what is really causing this flooding? There's a lot of theory that the Jonglei Canal, and Honorable, you've mentioned something about the Jonglei Canal, and some people are saying that the water in Egypt and Sudan are blocking the water, and that's why there's flood in Jonglei and Upper Nile. Can you, I don't know, I just want to pick up on your knowledge here. Can you take us through a little bit more of what is really the cause? Is the flooding related to what is happening? Anything related with Jonglei Canal? I hope my question makes sense.
Let me just try to come in.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, let me just try to come in. I think the cause of the flooding is not, Jonglei Canal has nothing to do with the cause of flooding. What we know is we have a lot of rainfall in areas of Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, and the level of Lake Victoria has risen. That's why even now in Juba here, when you go by the riverside, you'll experience that. And since Jonglei, Upper Nile, and say Unity States, those are all floodplains, automatically the flooding will occur. But at the moment, the frequency of the flooding is what we are trying to talk about, because there used to be floods, but now the interval and the frequency has increased, because last year all those areas were flooded, and even this year. So that means we have to tie that to climate change. So what has happened now is not because of Jonglei or whatever is happening in Egypt, but also it's the level of water has risen in Lake Victoria, and that's due to also the high rainfalls that are happening there. So with climate change, there are areas that used to have average rainfall, they can have really high rainfall. And there are some areas that have high rainfall, then they will not have rainfall. So it's that variability that is happening and causing all this. So we have 10 years, according to the IPCC report, and the world has now, 2 years ago it was 12 years, but now we have 10 years to be able to reverse the impact of climate change by cutting down into the emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrogen oxide and all that. So that's what we are supposed to be looking into. How do we kind of like cut those emissions? That's now the remit to those developed countries, because they developed their country through burning coal and fossil fuel. But now the impact of their development trajectory is now affecting us. So we would like to reverse that. But since we have nothing to cut, what do? We have to adapt. So that's how we in most developing countries, mitigation is not a big thing to us. But a country like South Sudan, since we don't have those energy, electricity and stuff, instead of like burning fossil fuel, now instead we need now to kind of like invest in clean energy. So that's my contribution towards that. And it was not that we don't want to, I don't want to acknowledge that 7 of our states are under flood. I sympathize with the situation of all our people in the country that are affected with these floods, droughts, and extreme weather, heat waves, and dust storms that we don't usually have. All these are now coming to our situation. So it's not our fault, but somebody is responsible for it. That's why we need to make sure with the coming COP26 in Glasgow, which I will be leaving next week, we'll go and advocate for the interests of our people, the cutting of emissions, and also trying to make sure that adaptation is considered as one strategy for coping with the impacts of climate change. Because the developed countries are only focusing on mitigation, but because they have all what to cut. But for us, We have nothing to mitigate at the moment, but only adapt. And it's going to cost a lot. As Census said in the beginning, in our document, we have made sure that we have included the issues of gender, because not all of us are affected equally. Women and children are impacted. And you know, in our situation, women are people who really take care of our households, and they are the ones who are really impacted with this impact of climate change. So the provision of water, harvesting water and bringing water closer to them is something that we really need to look into and try to make sure that we change their livelihoods. We provide them with all the necessities for life so that they will be able to survive and adapt to this new situation that has been imposed to all of us. Yeah. Thanks.
Yep. I don't know if anybody want to ask anything, but one of the viewers did comment and say that actually Warrap State, it's in Tony, is currently underwater. Somebody even sent a picture. And Unity State, as you just mentioned. And I don't know, Niall or Census, do we know any other place that is currently flooded apart from the states that we've just mentioned?
Yeah, I think, okay, thank you very much. I think it would be correct to say that the whole country is basically underwater. You know, it is the degree of impact that is different. That's why people are focusing on Jonglei, Unity, and Upper Nile. But, you know, we know that South Sudan lies within the Nile Basin. More than 90% of South Sudan is basically within the Nile Basin. That means all the water that is going through the river comes all the way through our country, throughout our country. And so this means that the river Sobat brings water from Ethiopia, and those places, Upper Nile, those counties east of Upper Nile, they get flooded through that. Same thing with the Nile here, going through flooding Central Equatoria, Eastern, and going all the way to Jonglei and Upper Nile and Unity. And then, of course, the Barghazal River system actually is the one that is flooding the states of Barghazal and Unity State, basically. So let me add on to something that people, in fact, people have been talking about this issue, conspiracy theories about what is causing the flood. What is causing the flood has already been mentioned, but let me add something here. It is the heavy rainfalls in East Africa. But what caused that heavy rainfall? What caused that is the increase in the temperatures in the Indian Ocean. East Africa receives its rainfalls mostly from the Indian Ocean. And there is a climate variability phenomena in the Eastern Africa, in the Indian Ocean, called the Indian Ocean Dipole. The Indian Ocean Dipole fluctuates from positive, which is warming, to negative, which is neutral, to neutral, which is normal, and then to negative, which is cold. So in the period where the dipole is basically warm, we receive a lot of rainfalls. And this is part of the climate variability, which was explained earlier. But now if you add the global increase in temperatures, then you now balance, put that off the balance. In fact, scientists from Australia mostly actually discovered these phenomena in the Indian Ocean, the Indian Ocean Dipole. And they have observed that Indian Ocean dipole, or the sea temperatures in the Indian Ocean, have actually increased by up to 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, this was witnessed in October 2019. And this was the start of the flood episode that we are witnessing now. It led to the rise in the level of Lake Victoria for the first time, reaching 13.24 since 1960s. And we know 1960s, or historically, there is another period that is associated with heavy flood. And what was causing that is the dipole. But also what is observed about the dipole is that the dipole, the frequency of dipole actually has increased. So instead of happening up to maybe 10 years or 8 years, it is not happening like that anymore. That means that's why we are witnessing extreme floods, like very, very frequently, unlike in the past. Because some people have been talking about this flood is not flood is normal thing. Because when you read in history, you will see people in 1921 talking about the flood of 1916 to 1919 and trying to come up with solutions. But those floods used to be part of the normal flood variability. But now, as I said earlier, if you go back to 1901 to 2021, you see 26 incidents. You go back to 1961 to 1991, you see 17 incidents. You go back to 31 to 61, you will see even fewer floods, 11 of them. So this pattern basically is increasing, as you can see, and what is causing it is the rise in global temperatures, basically. And so the floods are being caused by the increase in the temperatures, which has actually affected the global weather system. And that's why we are witnessing this one. But the dams upstream, the downstream, basically cannot come back. You will see Sudan getting submerged first before we get submerged in South Sudan. If you are talking about the dam in Egypt or the dam in Sudan, the dam in Sudan actually the closest one, and the backwater curve for the Jebel Aulia Dam, which is close to us, comes up to Melut in South Sudan. But that is the end of it, because the rest of the South Sudan is a bit higher than in Melut, than in northern Sudan, because as you go, it becomes lower and lower. And so if water goes back, the nearby surrounding areas will have to be submerged first. So our problem of flooding is coming upstream. And our flood is coming from 4 directions: from Ethiopia through the Sabat, from the Nile, from Uganda through the Nile, from Congo through other tributaries, from Congo and Central Africa through the Juriba and other tributaries, and even from Darfur because of the Kir or the Barara River, and it all goes into the Nile system. So this is where we are getting flooding. And so when we want to talk about the solution, when we talk about Jonglei Canal, it is not going to solve the flooding, because you will still have problem of flooding in Bargazal region. You will also even still have problem in eastern part of Upper Nile because so bad. So what you will need to do, you have to actually put mechanism in place for those places. Even though I don't believe actually the Jonglei Canal can actually solve the flood, because it was not intended to solve the flood. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know. I know this discussion is getting interesting, and this is what our viewers want to discuss. I don't know, Census, if you want to just tiny bit add something on that, or do we move on? But this is really, I think this is the heart of our discussion, and I think the cause of what we're experiencing. So I don't know, Census, if you want to add something on that before.
Yeah, I think the part that I want to add is for people to understand the areas that have affected people the most due to the flooding. So, for instance, in Central Equatoria, it's around Gumbo and Lologo, around the Nile River. And if you go to Jongole, it's in areas of Jale. If you go up to Malakal, it's areas that are around these water bodies, right? But the other issue too is that these areas are now also becoming overpopulated. So in the past, Gumbo, these Condokoro Islands we have, for instance, in Central Equatoria, were not highly inhabited with people. There were very few people there. And for them, they had means of trying to survive this. Secondly, they weren't also plowing so much next to the river, but now you have a lot of plowing, but you also have construction by the river boundaries itself, which means there's a lot of digging and trenching going in, and this in a way opens up more areas for the water to push into, and it also decreases the high elevation that perhaps existed to try and decrease the amount of water that's coming. Then you look at places like Gumbo, you look at certain places in Bor, in Jale, even the ones in Jongole. These areas are actually low elevation. And as Africano stated, these are swamps. These are flat plains. These are swamps. You really shouldn't be having people living in them. you know, people who have constructed. You have a number of people who went and constructed in Gumbo. All of this construction were ones that shouldn't have actually happened, because these are areas that are known a part of this island systems along the river, and even the ones along the Sud that get flooded, and they're swamps. So, you know, I think our biggest challenge is, how do we balance this increased population encroachment in sensitive areas, especially when these areas are around the cities and places that people want to be in? What are the extreme measures that can really be taken that people will accept? Because when you hear people crying about the impact, you know, you feel pity for them, but then you're also sitting and thinking, you shouldn't be here, but we understand you being here. How do we change this process of decreasing the number of people who are there, or of increasing the number of dikes, the embankments that we need, or even delineating and not allowing people to build anything along 100-year flood line? And those are things that I know are in contentious for Africano to deal with. But I just want to put that there. So I also want people to understand that the more you're an area that is already affected, the worse the impact is on all of you. Thank you.
But I just want to add a follow-up question. I think here, who should be responsible? Who is the responsible institution, the government? Who should be preventing people not to build in some of flood-prone areas? Shouldn't it be part of the policies or strategies or plans that the government are making to make sure that we adapt and mitigate to climate change? I want to take that back to Honorable. And what are we doing about people building on floodplain?
Yeah, one thing that I would like to, yes, it's the government that is supposed to control or plan where people are supposed, or where construction is supposed to take place, where cities or towns are supposed to be built. But in our situation, as you know, I grew up in Juba all my life. And by then, the population of Juba was not more than 100,000. And the limits of Juba were really, the airport was the outer limit to the north. Then to the east, we have Nyakuron Culture Center. Then from Nyakuron Culture Center up to Jebel Kujur, that was a forest. Okay, and every Saturday people go hunting. Then Tomping, the current Tomping, was a swamp. Yeah, all of Tomping, the airport side, and up to now you can just see we still have paiparas in most of the areas there. And places like Gudele and the rest that are now experiencing floods too, Referendum, Mia Sab and the rest, those are all swampy areas. But the haphazard expansion of Juba after the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, when people came back, then people started settling. And also the policy that we adopted was the land belongs to the community. Then some chiefs started distributing land and all that kind of stuff. So the town planning was not there. So areas that were not supposed to be inhabited are now being, people are building, and so, and there is now a problem of who owns the land, because the community, when you want something, you go to the Bari chiefs, you agree with them, they give you land, regardless of whether it's a swampy area or whatever. But now I think the best thing that we'll like to do is we need to empower our Ministry of Infrastructure, like what is happening now with the town planning, the city planning of Ramshell. That is something that we are supposed to do, because Juba is all haphazard kind of like expansion. And I usually fret when I start thinking of how we're going to take care of our sewage or trying to get water in those areas. So it is going to be a lot of rezoning that needs to take place. And the only thing that we need to do now is to start thinking of a new place, and we start kind of like putting a plan where we know where our water pipes will be, our power lines will be, our roads, our sewage system, and all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to kind of like, so we have a huge problem that needs to be taken care of. Even now in Juba, you can just see the mayor going to areas like Haisora, Malakal. People have encroached to the main roads, and he's trying to open the roads and all that kind of stuff. So there is a lot of mess in that area, and I think that is something that the Ministry of Infrastructure or Housing should look into the town planning, because now we need to have smart cities, we need to have green cities and all that kind of stuff. So the planning has to start. We know that what we have now looks good, but it's just something that cropped up and not well planned, or we don't have a design of even getting water to our people. At the moment, you can even see the whole city of about 1.2 million people. We are being serviced with water tanks, water tankers, and all that kind of stuff. So it's going to be a huge problem to really get our city in a way that it has to be functional. When you go to areas of near the bridge, Guduge and the rest, those years in the 70s, we used to have a farm there. We used to cultivate maize and all of that. So this market that has, the whole place is flooded, because when the river overflows its banks, it goes all the way close to our farm. So all the snakes and everything do come up there. And these are now the areas that are being impacted, because people who came, they just decided to settle there. But these are swampy areas. And I think like what has happened in Kenya, all the swampy areas, all the swamps needs to be reclaimed. And it's something that we as the ministry are trying to make sure we will try to look into that. We have come up with an order that we don't want to see any building like 100 meters in both banks of the river. So just imagine 100 meters from the river. Now all the construction that have happened, like FX, Da Vinci, and the rest, all those hotels, they are just like 3 meters from the river. So if we are going to implement that, it's going to cause a lot of problem. But the law is there. And for the streams, we have at least 20 meters from each side in order to protect that. So time will come that we will need to reclaim all those wetlands, because they are the lungs of our towns and cities. And as I said earlier, we should try not to go and settle in areas that we know that they will be flooded, unless we have the capacity to construct buildings that will be able to withstand the floods, and we can have channels, and we can live in. When we have that money, then we'll be able to do that. But since we don't have that economic power to be able to construct in rivers or swamps and all that, we need to look into higher grounds and all that kind of stuff. At the same time, one thing that we also need to look into the policy, the land policy, because people need to find areas that are suitable for habitation and for agriculture, and everybody has the right to move anywhere that he will be able to have a good livelihood, than trying to only put ourselves within our areas and simply say, I cannot go to the next place. So that's something that as a country, we need to accept ourselves, and people have to relocate to places that are habitable. Thanks.
Thank you, Honorable, for that contribution. That's very important. And I just want us to take us back and just let our viewers know that, we've talked of what climate change is, what are the impact and the consequences. And I think our next session, I want us to sort of highlight what are some of, Honorable, you've already mentioned before some of the mitigations and adaptations that we need to put in place to be able to mitigate this climate change effect. The question here is, how is the government responding to the current flooding emergency across the country? What are some of the preparedness mechanisms do we have in place to respond to the impact of flooding to the community? I'll go back to you, Honorable, for 2 minutes, and then Census, and then Niall, and then Miriam, if you can hear us, you guys as well can jump in to add on top of that.
What I've known, because when this flooding started, I was out of the country, and I know that I was in New York for the United Nations General Assembly, but the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs and the Minister of Water Resources and Irrigation visited most of the affected areas. And at the last sitting of the Council of Ministers, the government has pledged or have approved $10 million for emergency relief for our people, and also they have appealed for humanitarian assistance. Yes, that amount is not enough, but I think the most important thing for us is, since climate change is here to stay with us, we now need to get a lot of adaptation mechanisms, because it's not only going to be a 1 year, it's going to be multiple years of getting all these kind of like impacts. It's not only going to be flooding alone, droughts are going to be there. We're going to have extreme heat waves, dust storms, and also invasion from exotic species, and also some diseases that are foreign to our country because of the change of weather. Now we have a lot of people suffering from cancers and all that. So the climate change will actually be impacting us a lot, and that's why long-term strategies are required. Not only this Ban-A, trying to see that we provide people with plastic sheets here, some bags of beans or maize, but it has to be a long-term thing that has to be part of the government strategy and plans, such that in the next 30 or 50 years, we will be able to now live comfortably or try to adapt to it and try to have a livelihood, regardless of what kind of climate extreme situations do impact us. So we have to be prepared. Disaster preparedness has to be there. And people, because it's not the government that is supposed to be telling you. We have indigenous knowledge. We know which places are prone to floods, which places were areas that people didn't occupy, and also we have to look into town planning. That is one thing that we also need to look into that. So it's a situation there where each and every one of us is responsible. It's just like your security. You cannot get somebody or a bodyguard that will be taking care of you 24/7. You also need to kind of like really use your mind and try to adjust to the current situation. Thanks.
So Census, Niall and Miriam, if you can hear us, is that I want to, I'll start with you, Niall, and then Census. What do you guys think about the current response government have toward flood emergency? Is it appropriate? Is there something more we could be doing? And yeah, so I'll stop there and I'll give you guys a stage.
Okay, thank you very much. This is an important question. Responding to disasters like this is an important thing because you are saving lives. So whether these respond by the government is enough or not, I think the overall, because when we are talking about this issue, we want to actually place it within the context, which is that it is climate change. And if it is climate change, it means that we have to prepare for it and adapt to it so that every year we don't have to be caught off guard. Yes, it is in fact allocating $10 million to really save lives now, I think is applauded. is commendable. But I think our efforts and responses to disasters have been very disorganized, to say the least, because they are not organized. They are not coming from the top, and they are scattered. They are, from, let's say, starting with the communities, coming to the government, coming to humanitarian agencies. We have to embrace the fact that the climate is changing and that the flood is here to stay and will be coming to us every now and then. And so we need to move actually beyond fighting the fire to basically adapting. And that means in South Sudan, actually, it will be easy to adapt than any other place in the world. Let's say if you move Bo Town away from where it is now, it will be easy because it will be less costly than if you build it 10 years later, you realize it's not sustainable and you need to move. So locating the cities now, or even demolishing buildings that are sitting in water courses, in wetlands, is much easier now to do than you can do it later when people have actually built permanent structures, more costly ones. And so the kind of response that I would like to see for the government is a response that integrates climate change adaptation into all the policies. Like Honorable said earlier, that they already have NAPA, they have NAP, National Action Adaptation Plan, and then all other, these documents are already there. In fact, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry should be applauded for doing that. But this effort is not going across, climate change is cross-cutting. It's not going across all the institutions of the government. And so, and to me, it should start from the highest office, from the office of the president. Let's see how countries are responding to climate change. In Kenya, the climate change unit sits in the highest office in the land to coordinate and to bring it closer to the decision maker. In Ethiopia, the same thing. Everywhere you put it where the decision is made, so that you prioritize it, and then you allocate enough money. Like 10 million actually is nothing. It's small. And if we were to know that this is coming every year, and then now our biggest portion of the budget should be going to these disasters, because it's actually our number one threat, and it's a national security threat. And if it is a national security threat, something that is a national security threat is something that threatens people, the lives of people, their livelihood, their economy, their culture, and their social life. And this is what climate disasters is. And so my point is for the government to integrate climate change adaptation into all the policies, into financing, budgeting, like the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, which is the focal ministry for these issues, the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs and Disaster Management, which is another ministry that responds to disasters. They have the lowest budget on the national. It tells you that the government response is not coherent and is not on the top priority of the government. And so it should move. So climate disasters should move to the agenda. If security issues like such as conflict are on top of the government, then the two of them should sit on top of the government agenda. How to end conflict, how to adapt and become resilient to climate disasters. I think this is the way that I see it. And I want to see our government exploring avenues for coming up with mega projects to really adapt people to climate change. Projects such as building dams upstream to manage water, to hold back excess water, like the water that is coming from Uganda. If we had built a dam in Nimili, it would be holding that water back. If it is too much water, then we can hold it back, and it will sit there until when we know that it will be safe for our people downstream in Juba, in Bor, in Malakal. We can also build another dam inside Ethiopia on the Baro River. In fact, that project actually has been talked about for a while. And that will control the flooding downstream in Eastern Upper Nile, in Maywood, in Nasser, in those places. And we can also plan for such similar projects in Barghazal to control flood, in the Barghazal river system there to control flood. In fact, our people need to actually move away from rivers. In fact, at the moment, our people live close to the rivers. And to see these, check the maps. You will see the maps where the villages are. The villages are all close to the rivers. And the reason simply is because of two things: insecurity and lack of access to water. So people want to be close to water so that they can access water. People want to be staying away from their enemies, neighboring enemies.
Mm-hmm.
So like the case in Jonglei State is the same thing. If you see between a large tract of land, which is a bit much better, well drained actually, sitting between Leh and Dinkabur and Lawnware, it's a huge land. And of course, people say, stay away from there because of insecurity. Now the government, if the government has to come in, a better response is to respond to communal conflict and to relocate people to such areas and deploy police and armed forces to protect people. And that way, such a policy has to be integrated basically and holistic for such a policy to be really very effective in terms of responding to climate disasters. I think let me give the rest the chance.
Yeah. Okay. So census and then Miriam. I hope now you can hear us. Because you can add.
Thank you very much, Nyathon and Nyal, for bringing all that out. I think first, I'm just going to try and bring in the pain and the neglect that our citizens are feeling. A lot of them have mentioned that government is not lacking, that they are disturbed and really just angry about the way government has not acted at all in a critical manner about the current impact of droughts, flooding, the climate disasters that South Sudan is going through. Some of them have gone on to say that all that South Sudan is doing is really just to try and save the civil population, get them out. But everything else regarding that process is lacking, because from what we have seen, some government officials have even gone to call upon the UN to help with all of this relocation, resettlement process, and that the process it's currently more of an afterthought of what to do, yet we're going through it all the time. So there is a lack of real planning about saving people's lives and critical lives. Another part that I have seen some people bring up was that government talks, and these are comments from people, that government talks about a lack of fiscal budget, the issue of the economy, but yet the same government is able to spend money on things that are not considered important, such as expansion of cars, of the parliament, of all of these entities that eat money without real accountability on how it's impacting the real livelihoods of people. So communities in these places are all crying and complaining, and they are distraught. And on top of that, we're at war. We're in a current physical conflict, and this physical conflict, that's going on internal, also just means that there is a lot of disasters at play. So to all these people, they are wondering, where's our government? I mean, we understand we're constantly told they're a baby because of 10 years of independence, but is this how they want to see us? Without food, without water, flooded, no way to live our lives. And how do we see this going forward? So I want to put that out because I think it's important we bring the ordinary voice into this discussion. And when we go on to it, because of this lack of funding that Nyal has talked about, this means there is no money that's put into trying to save their lives, nothing put in terms of trying to deal with the impact of cholera and malaria, the rise of all of these diseases, waterborne diseases that we see expanding during flooding, and even the lack of food during drought season. All of this is left to non-profit international agencies to deal with. So it's important we put this out so people also understand we hear their pain and we want this put out to the public. I like what Niall brought forward, and I think Africano also brought it, which is that climate change, climate variability, climate disaster is actually a national security issue. And we need to state that national security entity, very important, because I think sometimes there is a lack of understanding what is national security. People think it's all about guns and war and military. No, there is a part of it which is about protecting your citizens, which is about taking care of your citizens and your resources, because they are the ones who create and make what this country is all about. So we look at it and we look at the fact that the lack of coordination, planning, and prioritizing it's really disturbing. On real sense, if we are to put this as an important issue, it needs to be part of the national security policy. And when it's put into that policy, it's important to understand what climate disasters actually even lead to and the impacts they have that make them so valuable. First, you have the issues of displacement. And when you have displacement, it means people are relocated to communities where they could be in conflict with each other. But then also, these relocations that are currently happening or resettlement are supposed to be the government role. Currently, we find that countries from outside, people in the diaspora, are the ones bringing and sending money to help their communities deal with this type of resettlement they need to do, and even relocating and starting life in another areas. This is an issue that should be the government role. Secondly, there's conflict over a lot of basic resources. When there are conflict over basic resources, you have a lot of lives being lost on all of this, instead of critical issues of building this country, of becoming part of it and becoming a productive source within it. And this also means we lose a lot of financial capital. So when we look at how bad some of these flooding are, you realize that you can't take food by truck or supplies by truck from Ugandan border all the way going up to Upper Nile during rainy season, because it's impossible. People are not able to get life-saving goods, medication, food. None of that is able to go through. This is a danger to our society. And we end up spending so much money flying all of this. But if we had these infrastructures developed properly, and as a national security entity, we will actually push to make this happen. You look at the road that was constructed, and when it rained and flooded, all of that road just ate up. How much money was spent on that road? And it got eroded so fast. Why? Because this road was not considered critical enough to be constructed in a manner that had long-term vision. So this part results in the part that, our economy becomes on a standstill. And I think we also look at our movement of wildlife, and that during these seasons, there's a lot of encroachment that are happening. Drought results in people going into forests, increase in hunting, illegal hunting. These are all illegal processes that are happening. And you find all of this being shipped across the country to other countries where they are sold as expensive wild meat. All of these make them critical for the national security entity and a priority for government and the president, as Niall has said. When we put that forward, we will also be able to train part of our army to be the group that deals with disaster response, that are there to help relocate people, that are there with all the equipment needed to build all of these emergency embankments that we need. And to finally conclude, I think we have to understand that this has to be part of the strategic environmental assessment, strategic model of how our country needs to be developed and managed, because floods are going to be there and they're going to increase because of this climatic patterns that have also become extreme. Drought are also going to be there and they're going to continue, meaning food source, food supply are at a danger. This is the part that I really want to put forward, and I think Miriam will be able to add more on that. Thank you.
Yes, to you, Miriam. And I think here, Miriam, based on what Niall has said and Census and Honorable Africana, how do you think is government prepared to respond to similar disasters in the future? Do we have the mechanism for them to do that?
Thank you for the question. Let me start by saying in June 2018, the UN Environment, in partnership with the National Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and I think other stakeholders, they launched the South Sudan's first State of Environment and Outlook report. And in that report, one of the key recommendations was to build resilience of the communities to climate change shocks, and which will then help in minimizing the impact on their livelihoods and avoid displacements. So as we have already discussed about this, we are seeing people already migrating because of flooding in some areas. So I would clearly say the government is not adequately prepared for the impacts of climate change. And we know that if this displacement and migration is not checked, it can lead to increased conflicts and even violence, which will lead to devastating consequences for this country. I also know that the South Sudan is a signatory of the Montreal Protocol to the Vienna Convention of Substances that depletes ozone layer, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, the International Plant Protection Convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Convention to combat desertification. And South Sudan has also adopted the National Adaptation Programs of Actions within the UN framework of Convention of Climate Change. And it's a good step to have all these signatories and have all these structures and documents in place. But without implementing some of these key things discussed, for example, in the National Adaptation Programs of Action, South Sudan government gave 5 main priority areas, which are very good. The first one was to promote reforestation and agroforestry to reduce floods and droughts and their impacts. Second one was to manage and conserve wetlands so as to have enough water resources. The third one was to promote climate smart agricultural techniques to increase food security. The fourth one was to establish improved drought and flood early warning systems. And the last one was to integrate climate change into the national policies and planning processes. So we have a proper policy in place, but what we need to see is now the implementation of all these things that have been said. Otherwise, we'll keep seeing a repeat of what has happened year in, year out. Thank you, Census. Nathan.
Yep. I think we have lost Honorable Africana, and I wanted him to sort of highlight a little bit on Sendai framework, because this is a disaster management framework, and I'm aware that the Humanitarian Affairs Ministry has actually, it's one of the framework they are working from. So it could have been good to hear from the government perspective, how far are we in terms of implementing some of the priority in this framework? I don't know if anyone of us here has any knowledge on Sendai framework. And if not, we'll wait, and if he comes back, and then I'll come back to that question. So I think, Niall, we've really discussed some of the alternative of what government could do to prepare and respond to climate change, the impact of flooding that has happened today. What is the long term? And here as well, this question is actually to all of you. We've exhausted our questions, and I just want us to dive in. What is the short term? You've talked about structural infrastructure that we need to be in place, and these are long term in terms of building dams, in terms of building dikes, in terms of incorporating all this, the climate change into all policies across different government institutions. What could we do now? Because we know that flood is not going to wait for us. People will be affected. What is the immediate solution can government do now to save lives and infrastructure for the communities?
Okay. Thank you very much. I think because we are now in a disaster situation, I think the first thing is to actually respond and save lives. At the moment, the situation is completely devastating. People are affected. And let me underscore this. When you compare the numbers, 2019, 2020, and this year, you can see the numbers are not the same. This year, fewer people are reported affected, and it doesn't mean that the magnitude of the disaster is small. it means that some of the places affected last year, people moved away. For example, in counties in Jonglei, like Bor County, Twitches County, Duke County, you go to other places in Upper Nile, Fibor, like the places that are now affected. People had already moved away, and that's why you are seeing fewer numbers in terms of the impact, because it is the flood is just going through the land and nobody's found there. But yet still people who actually would return after the dry season have been affected basically. So what we need to do now is actually to evacuate people and take them to places where they will have temporary shelters, and have some places to engage in livelihood activities such as farming and so on and so forth. And because, let's say in some places, let me give example in Twitches. Twitches is completely submerged. It's one of the counties that are completely submerged. And they have been submerged since 2019, actually. Even though, the total submersion happened in 2020. So what we need to do now in the next 1 to 2 years, 3 years going down the road, these places are not going to be reachable. Even if people go back during the dry season, they will still going to be displaced. If we compare this pattern of flood with the pattern of 1960s, we don't expect people to go to these places that are affected now and live comfortably. So that means we actually need to prepare them, take them to where they should stay, and they should stay peacefully with those they are staying with. That means you dialogue, the government should actually come in and dialogue with the host communities who have the land and say, okay, give them this land, they will stay here, and then they will go back. In addition, the other alternative is that some of these places that I highlighted earlier, they have some areas that are a bit higher. And that means you need to actually locate them there. If there is an issue of insecurity, the government needs to address that insecurity issue to allocate people to those areas that are a bit higher. So that should be the same across the country, actually, where people are affected. Identifying higher ground should be a priority now. This thing can happen actually now, locate people in those places. And then the next thing that should happen is actually to look at options such as dikes. Dikes are actually medium term. I don't think it can even be long term, because you can complete them. Census, I remember you were part of the team that did the environmental impact assessment for the construction of Bor County's dikes and roads, I think between 2005 and 2006, right? And I remember that dike did not take long, actually. It finished within a year to 2 years, or within that time frame. I was not there anyway, but it was built in my area anyway. But based on what I have read, it did not take too long. So if that is the case, then we need actually to come in and build dikes in places that are affected. That means in Jonglei counties, in Unity counties, in Werrap, in Awil, because there are areas that are flood prone. So, and then you also locate people higher ground. We also need to actually dredge our rivers. Our rivers have not been dredged for the last 40 years, more than 40 years actually.
What do you mean dredge? What is dredge?
To remove the siltation. Actually, there has been accumulation of sand and debris and so many other things in the rivers. So the rivers have become shallower. So that's why you see the water that is coming upstream from Uganda and other upstream countries is finding no enough room in the rivers, and so it's going to normally dry areas as flood. And so if we dredge them, it will minimize actually the Bangladesh flood. So that one should also be done, and that can also be another thing that we can do within 1 to 2 years. So flood can be done actually within a year. We can actually do an emergency flood, an emergency dike. To stop the water, and then we can actually go and actually design do studies and design a much better dike. And dike can be done all across South Sudan, where in places that are currently affected. That means government has to actually come up with a mechanism where it should come up with funds and ask humanitarian and development partners to top up those funds and build this small infrastructure system to actually build resilience. It will be part of the resilience. And then, of course, long term will involve the dams, which I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Let me go back a bit briefly to the historical.
Just do that and then forward it to census, because we're running a bit of time as well, so that census can add.
So the historical search for the solution for flood has been going on for the last 100 years, by the way. And so coming up with the Equatorial Nile project that proposed a series of dams that would be used to actually store excess water, to control flooding, and to regenerate electricity. South Sudan need to actually visit these plans because the studies are there. Actually, the Jonglei investigation team actually did these studies to see the impact all the way from Uganda up to South Sudan to Sudan. So these ones should be revisited by the government of South Sudan. The government should come up with a new team that will incorporate foreign experts who have done studies like this. There are some of the Dutch experts actually who have done their model, like this guy called Sutcliffe. He's actually the foremost expert on the hydrology of the Nile system. And others also, their work should be consulted and can be used by the experts to actually design durable solutions. Thank you very much.
Census.
So to just continue with that, Niall, I think you Thank you. To just continue with what he put, I think I want to put first basis is that we need to remove politics from saving lives and prioritize saving lives regardless of where they are. And this part is important because of the tribal aspect of South Sudan and South Sudan politics, which underscores the impact of disasters in certain areas and decides on how much value someone's life is based on where they come from or their region or their tribe or all of that. So all of that needs to be put off and just prioritize saving human beings. And when we look at that, I think on a short-term basis, and the urgent one that's needed is really, having a defense corps or group relocate people, and perhaps if there is an issue of understanding how to do these processes, then work with the nonprofits that are currently doing it to understand how best to plan to relocate people, get them to higher ground, and start availing resources to them, food, water, and whatever is possible just for them to survive their basic needs. That's a priority at the moment. Secondly, if we go further, and Niall stated the program of the dikes. Yes, in 2005, I was part of a group that did an assessment for WFP and USAID to try and build dikes along the Jonglei, the river banks. But here, the one thing that I would like to bring forward was that, and it's something I constantly try to challenge nonprofits on non-governmental organizations on, which is that some of this, there are ways of trying to build embankments that make them have long-term survival. And some of the best way of doing that is by using stones and some kind of metal sheets to try and cover and create that embankment. A lot of what has been done on South Sudan has involved just using maram, which is the mud, to build it, but these are not sustainable, right? So if you compact the mud, it can survive for one flood season. The next one, it's already eroding very fast, meaning funds are constantly being spent to do this over and over again, as opposed to looking at a type of dike that is a bit more long-term. So there is a need to reevaluate how this is done and for government to put its resources into it. A lot of these are easy to do. They are not highly technical, meaning almost everyone can get to do that. You don't need high specialists to do it, except for the hydrological mapping. Moving forward, I think we also need to look at what Africano was talking about, funding required for all of those other mitigation and adaptation plans. And one important one is expanding on our early warning system. I know someone on the chat wanted to understand what information exists in terms of traditional early warning systems. Perhaps that needs to be brought out to the open, but also we need an expansion of the number of river stations, the river level stations, as well as the rain meter stations, for us to be able to collect those data at a more local level and find ways of trying to transmit this information to people very early in the season, so they understand that this is the weather that we are going to face. We need you to start moving, or we need you to start making plans. This needs to happen, whether it's going to be through text messages, radio, but it needs to be in a way that is effective for people. And I also think sometimes people need to see and understand the impact of these disasters, so that they weigh on whether they really want to continue to stay in these flooding zones or not. Because one way or the other, they're going to be losing all of their belongings and livelihoods. And going and doing this at every season level is a danger. But when we go into that, we are also forced to look into how land is allocated. Because if someone has to leave their ancestral land because it's on a flat plain, where do they go? How does government or the state authority help allocate new land for them that is not along those flooded zones? That part is important. On a long-term basis, it's for us to fully map our country, map the vulnerability areas, and make sure development occurs according to these regions. Because the cost of planning, it's much less than the cost of trying to respond. So map all of that and prioritize. When we go into looking at drought, I think this is important. It needs to be broad, because we have a large group of cattle herders that move based on drought. Why? Because they haven't learned the ability of doing controlled pastoral land farming, where you divide your land into pieces and decide which areas people graze on. Work needs to go into helping people understand grazing patterns and changing that within their locality, because migrating with cattle all the way to other land where there is a lot of conflict, and you find cattle keepers, because of cattle rustling, move around with guns. There's a lot of lives that are lost from that type of movement. And when a lot of them move, they move into areas that are agriculture. And it's important for us to accept and understand that our land is based on different zones. We have zones that are agricultural, we have the flat plains, we have our rocky or mountainous region. So people live and survive based on the livelihoods they have. For farmers in communities that actually are agrarians, the land is important to them. When cattle keepers come in, this causes a huge conflict. They lose their resources, but they are also not, they also don't have the defense mechanism to even deal with this. This brings the role of government, and this is why it's also an important national security issue into play, for them to champion this process. I remember a few weeks ago, a group of soldiers was sent across the Luri to try and get all cattle herders up. They did not understand the river, and these same soldiers who were going, the truck actually fell in the river, and some of them lost their lives in the Luri River. This is important, because this means there's really a lack of planning and understanding that these rivers are too heavy, they're too strong for you to even try and play with them in that means. So it's a national security issue that government has to take seriously. People are crying on the ground, requiring these responses to actually make sense and make a change into their life. And during drought, we are forced to start relying on people to do food drops. Yet we have a region in the country that is very agricultural viable. So long term, there's a need to start prioritizing and increasing the type of agriculture and making sure we even have the roads ready to carry things over. Niall brought the issue of dams, which is important, but it requires prioritizing. A lot of dams as well as hydroelectric dams have been talked about. And we find that the donors, some of them have put money into some of this, but there is a lack of reciprocating that from the government so that these projects can start. So government has to put citizens a priority, put climate change, climate disasters a priority, and act upon that to save more lives. Thank you. I hope I have summarized most of these points.
No, you have. You have. I think we have exhausted most of our question that we needed to be covered. Honorable African is having technical problem. He's in and out. And I think we'll just go ahead and conclude our session. We've actually gone more than what we planned. So what I would, just last thing, because I think we are focusing on so much on the government, right, in terms of responding to these climate disasters. I think community, private sector, and NGOs as well do have a role to play to save lives. I just want to throw that to you guys as well. Can somebody comment on that? What can ordinary citizen ask? What can we do to help? What can private sector? What can NGOs? What can they do to help instead of us just being helpless and they just expect the government to do everything? Yeah. So Miriam, you can start. I'll go to Neil and then Census.
Sorry, please come again.
Census, do you wanna?
Oh, Miriam just wanted you, I think, to repeat the question.
Repeat. Oh, okay. No, I was just saying that what are we've heard of the role of the government in terms of responding to climate disasters or flood. What is the role? What can private citizen, what can NGOs, and what can private sector do as well to help those who are impacted by the floods?
Okay. The NGOs can support the government. Things like early warning and emergency response. The NGO can step in and develop and establish a center for that, for example. We also need research institutions which can, educate and build a capacity in terms of climate change, information, knowledge. And so these are some of the areas I feel like the NGOs can step in and work with the government. Thank you.
Neil and then Census, or whoever can come first. Yeah. Okay. Census, go on then, Neil.
I think perhaps the communities are really already doing a lot. So when we talk about community support, we find that a lot of the diaspora are actually raising funds and sending funds in to help with community members. I think perhaps maybe there needs to be some kind of assistance in terms of helping people coordinate what is the best way of using some of this funds, so if there is a way of them being able to know that resources exist that they can easily access or can be brought to them, whether it's food that communities are sending this for, or it's building supplies or anything like that. I think it will be great if there is some kind of resource center or place where this information exists for them to have a way of coordinating, and so that even people who don't belong to those communities but want to donate can do so. From the private sector, they have a role to play because they are some of the groups that are really seriously affected by this, so perhaps also them coordinating with some of these community organizations to get resources out, but also expanding on having trained private sector teams, whether it's in the engineering field, road construction, expanding all of that so there are enough people to help when these constructions are required, when this construction needs to be done. From the nonprofit and regional aspect, Miriam has already talked about making sure that we have all of these centers, but also I think training people locally to understand this data and be able to analyze it, and giving communities, some of the communities I think also need to be given the backup to know that you have the right to challenge what's going on, challenge what government is doing, challenge how this resource is used. So there is also a need for education, you know, because you find some of these communities are also dealing with other conflict, and some of this conflict relies on them supporting certain politicians, okay? But yet these politicians are not allocating resources not allocating resources well enough for communities. So with all of these levels of mismanagement going on in government, you know, this means that the resources these communities have do not actually come to them. So I think part of it is for communities to be able to challenge those who want them, to support them, that this is what we need. Unless you're bringing us this, we are not going to support you. I think they need to be emboldened enough to go and do that, because they're still losing lives, whether it's in the conflict where they're supporting specific political leaders, or climate disasters where they have nothing and no one to help them. So that part needs to be increased, and you know, they all need to know that they have the right to voice their opinion and challenge these processes.
So Nyan last, and then I'll conclude our session.
Okay, on what the NGOs, private sector, communities can do, like Census has said, you know, this category of the stakeholders, in fact, they have been doing a lot already, except that their capacity is small, especially the capacity of the communities is very small, and their capacity has basically been overwhelmed. So they, of course, they should be supported this time by the development partners and humanitarian partners. In fact, humanitarian partners have been engaging in responding basically to disasters, like providing food and shelter to people who are displaced. They are the ones who have been doing that. I think what has been lacking, even though it's not completely lacking, it's just that the effort is inadequate, is the effort of private sector. Even though I have seen them donating tents or donating things like materials for constructing dikes. There have been, some private sector entities have been doing those. But I think going with the overall and holistic response, I think they need to, like, these efforts should be, the idea is to actually coordinate all these efforts. Whatever small the communities bring, whatever small the NGOs, national NGOs, community-based NGOs, and international NGOs and the government, the effort should be actually the resources should be pulled together toward building resilience and adaptation to these climate extremes. So we should not be operating in silos. So like one community doing this, the other community doing that, and that effort is very small. It's overwhelmed by the magnitude of disaster. So to me, it is time to bring in together, coordinate private sector effort, communal-based effort, national NGOs effort, international humanitarian development effort, and then the government effort. All of them should be put together to really respond to all these in all the places that are affected. That way, it will say, because as we underscored earlier, these floods are going to stay, and if they are going to stay, we have to actually pull together our resources and do long-term, starting with the short-term to save lives, go with medium-term, like dikes, like dredging the rivers, like moving people to highland areas, like creating dialogues between communities so that they don't fight each other, like starting to reform land policies, do land zoning so that there is no conflict between different land uses, like land use for livestock, for agriculture, for wildlife, for mining, for like all these things need to be zoned, and people have to be put in places that are safer. So this is what I see going forward. I see a situation where we put all our efforts are put together, and all these efforts should be coordinated by the government, so that we can make much bigger impact in terms of saving lives, in terms of providing a durable and sustainable solution. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much to all of you. So what I'm hearing, what I've heard from all our conversation we have heard is the fact that climate change is here to stay. We should treat it as a national security issue. It needs to be included in the highest decision point, be it even we have a unit even within the president office that deals and coordinate all the effort of climate change. We need to integrate all climate change in all policies within the government institutions. We need to prepare and respond to those communities that are being affected. This thing is there. All of us, we have a role, be it the government, the community, and be it the private sector, all NGOs. This is an integrated effort that need all of us. I would like to thank you, all of you, to our viewers who have stayed with us throughout this conversation. I would like to give shout out to Animu, Attack Odor, Alier MJ, Majang, and Kim Jal. They have contributed to our conversation since we started. Nyamach Hoth as well, Gale Moses, and Attack, and all the other participants that I haven't mentioned. On behalf of South Sudan Women Intellectual Forum, I would like to thank our panelists here in the studio for this informative session and very interactive, and also to UN Women for their support always. This is an issue, we can't exhaust it now. It's a conversation we need to continue to have, because climate change, as we say, is going to be here. We are going to be impacted, and we need to start talking about it to make it a priority on government agenda. It is not on government agenda. We need these climate change projects to be funded. And the only way this can be done is for all of us to start talking about this issue. I hope our discussion has enlightened you and has given you more information of what climate change is, what role you can do, and what can we ask our government representative to do for us. So today, this is the end of our session, and I hope to see you guys next time. Bye-bye. Thank you guys so much. This has been amazing.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye.